Hello, my name is Agata Paszke and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Enjoy. So today we're going to talk about your work in philosophy of language and philosophy of linguistics, and we will focus on semantics and semantic theory. So I want to start by asking you, what is the point of doing semantics at all? Why engage in trying to construct semantic theories?
Right. I love the question, let me say. And it's not a question that's addressed nearly often enough in the literature, and you can probably see that I fuss about this from way back. So, what is semantics? Semantics is the study of the meaning of language, meanings of language. Now, so why is that interesting, you're asking? Okay, we have to think about what languages are first, and why do we suppose there are any? And we suppose there are any because languages are parts of the spatio-temporal physical world playing extremely important causal roles. So, that is, if we want to understand what's going on among people who have, or not just people, organisms that have languages, we have to posit certain properties to languages. And semantics is or should be seen as, the theorizing about what properties these languages have that enable them to play their very significant causal roles in our lives. Just to take a very simple example, which I'll probably come back to, I'm very fond of, it's helpful to get away from humans here when you're thinking really basic. Think of the honeybee. And the honeybee, it was discovered amazingly by von Frisch quite a while back. The honeybee's waggle dance, which it does on the side of the hive, is actually a language. And it has a very dramatic effect on the behavior of the bees. It's a language which represents the source, the direction and distance of the source of food. And this affects the way all the bees in the hive behave. So in order to explain bees, you actually have to say they have this language, and it's in virtue of the semantic properties of that language that the bees behave the way they do. That's my sort of model for why semantics is interesting. Of course, if you get into human language, it's much more complicated, has a much more dramatic role in our lives. So that's what we're after. We're after the properties of the language, of these symbols in the language that in virtue of which the language plays its causal role in our lives.
Great. So since we're talking about causal roles, let's talk about your theory of reference and how to classify it best. Because you famously hold that we designate thanks to designating chains underlying our uses of words, and these chains are composed out of groundings, reference borrowings, and abilities to designate. But at times you also talk about causal perceptual links, for instance,
Yeah.
when you treat about demonstratives. And there was a period in your life where you were even maybe slightly more sympathetic towards accommodating some kind of descriptive component and making it a causal descriptive or hybrid theory of reference. So what is your position as of November 2024?
Yeah, right. Well, you're quite right that there's been, when we think about singular terms, there hasn't been much of a change over my career, but there have been one or two changes, as you're pointing out. Okay, so what you're asking here is quite a big question. Let's take singular reference first of all. The reference of what are often called singular referring expressions. I prefer to call them designational terms, but let's not worry about the terminology. I'm thinking particularly of proper names, referentially used definite descriptions, and demonstratives. And what I did from the start is offer something like a unified theory of this. Unified in that they all are primarily, I offer primarily a causal theory of these. So let's go into that. Start with proper names. This is what really was one of the two key things that got me going on this was the extraordinary lectures I heard in 1967 from Saul Kripke, which of course are now absolutely famous because he brought in the book Naming and Necessity. Saul had, concerning proper names, two utterly brilliant thoughts. One a negative one and one a positive one. The negative one is the one I call the ignorance and error arguments. The received view of names, absolutely ubiquitous in the 50s and 60s before Saul. The received view was some form of description theory. That is to say, the reference of a name was determined by the sort of descriptions, by the descriptions that speakers, competent speakers, associated with it. This was everywhere. Sometimes there was a little bit of a modification of this view in the literature, where it wasn't just, it was more of an identifying requirement. You could get, maybe you didn't have to have a description that would identify the object, the referent, but if not, you would have to pick it out in a crowd. You had to be able to demonstrate. Okay, that was absolutely the received view. And along comes Saul, and he points out with his, what I call his ignorance and error arguments, that competent speakers of a name, competent speakers with a name, are often, in fact, perhaps almost always too ignorant or too wrong to provide the description that determines the reference. It's I think, one of the most devastatingly persuasive arguments in the business. And then he had a positive view that was also an absolute, a wonderful revolutionary view. How can they do this? Let's take the example of Aristotle. We all in philosophy, and of course in many, many other people, other areas of life, we use the name Aristotle to refer to Aristotle. And how can we do that if we don't have to associate descriptions that pick out Aristotle? And his idea was just brilliant. It's the idea of reference borrowing. We can do it, we can do it because we borrow from people in communication situations who can do it. So we do it because they do it. They can pass it on to us, and they can pass on this ability to refer to Aristotle, even if we are very ignorant or wrong about Aristotle. Of course, how did they do it? The people who passed it? Well, they got it from people before them. So what you've got here is a whole, according to Saul, a historical chain of borrowings going all the way back to the first users of the name Aristotle, obviously his contemporaries. I took this view over from Saul virtually without, I just modified it a bit because I wanted to make it more naturalistic. In fact, what was driving me was a sort of naturalism apart from which Saul didn't have any sympathy for. So I virtually took over this, what you might call causal theory of borrowing, with a small modification or two, but it left us with a question. So this tells us how we can borrow ultimately from the early users. How did the early users refer to Aristotle? How did it first get going that this name was referring to? Or as the jargon quickly got established, how did the reference get fixed? We can see how you can borrow it, but how did it get fixed in the first place? And that's where I came up with the theory of grounding that you point out. And the talk of causal perceptual links is really the center of the theory of grounding. What happens in a grounding is that you ground the name in its bearer by a causal perceptual link to the object that is the perceptual focus. So that's very briefly the theory of grounding. And this is not something that Saul had much to say about at all. He was very cagey about saying, in fact, very, very cagey about saying anything about how the first users established their reference. And it often looked as if he was prepared to contemplate a description theory of fixing. In fact, some people think that was his theory of fixing. I know that it wasn't, but it was certainly part of his. How do I know? Because I asked him. But it was certainly part of what he had in mind for fixing. I don't think any paradigm names are causally descriptively fixed. I think a few odd names are, like Jack the Ripper or Gareth Evans's example of Julius, the inventor of the zip. But they're very odd. Paradigm names, I think, are causally grounded. And they're not just grounded. This was something I added to the theory. They're not just grounded, and I think this is very important for dealing with cases of confusion and reference change. They're not just grounded in the initial dubbing, the baptism, if you like, putting it in Christian terms, the initial dubbing. They're typically multiply grounded. That is to say, the sort of causal perceptual link between a speaker and the object, which grounds the name in the object at the initial dubbing, is repeated many times, typically through the life of the object. I use the example of my late cat, Nana. Our use of the name Nana was grounded in Nana many, many times, not just at the initial dubbing, and indeed many other people grounded the name Nana because they met her, right? They saw her. And in all of those perceptual situations, you ground the name just as effectively as you did in the dubbing. Okay, so that's proper names. Very much, as you can see, what I was really inspired by Kripke and driven by the idea we must come up with a naturalistic Kripkean theory of proper names. And then there was definite descriptions. Now, the influence on me there in the published literature was from Keith Donnellan's famous articles in the 60s. However, I had already become acquainted with the ideas from my teacher at Sydney, Charlie Martin. Anyway, what are the ideas? Well, Donnellan pointed out very, very convincingly that we use definite descriptions in a way where the reference of our use is clearly not fixed by any associated descriptions. He left it what, as it were we referring to? What did determine what we were referring to? Well, he used an ordinary phrase, having in mind. So we can, as it were, use a definite description, having something in mind, which we are not, we may even be erroneously describing it, and we certainly may not be completely describing it. I can't remember if he drew much attention to this, but there are so-called incomplete descriptions. For example, I say, and this is a famous example, the table is covered with books, the table. And you say this in a room that's full of tables, but you're talking about a particular table, putting it in Donnellan sort of terms, which I always liked. You have a particular table in mind. So you're referring to it, but you're obviously not describing it. That raises, once again, just as with proper names, and Kripke with proper names, that raises, or should raise in our minds, the question, so in virtue of what are you referring to that table? And you can't here rest, as I'm sorry to say many people seem to be prepared to do, with this ordinary locution having a particular object in mind. I think it's pointing us in the right direction, but you need a theory of having this particular object in mind. And the theory, and this was the guiding idea that I had for my dissertation at Harvard, is the same sort of causal perceptual connection to the object that fixes the reference of a proper name. So that same causal perceptual link is fixing the reference of a proper name and fixing the reference of a referential use. I went down a route which quite a lot of people went down. It's not too clear whether Donald himself went down it, to claim that there was not only a referential use, but also a referential meaning. That is, this use was conventional and established, and I offered what has become known as, along with Margaret Reimer, we both offered the argument from convention. This referential use has to be considered as a referential meaning. So definite descriptions have these two meanings. One, the meaning, or something like the meaning captured by Russell, and the other, the sort of meaning demonstrated in a referential use. That last move from not only a referential use to a referential meaning was made in the face of a lot of criticism, most strikingly and importantly by Kripke himself, and people similarly influenced by Grice. These people responded to Donnellan's article and his emphasis on referential use by saying, yes, there's referential use, we agree, but don't let us be misled by that. This is not a referential meaning, there's just the Russellian meaning, that's all there is. The referential use is a pragmatic modification in a particular context. It's just, well, a conversational implicature or something like a conversational implicature. That's what it is. Well, Margaret Reimer and I resisted that with the argument from convention. We said no, it was actually a referential meaning. So that's proper names, definite descriptions, and now move to demonstratives. I argued again from the beginning that the reference of demonstratives, well, let's take a simple demonstrative, this and that. The reference is determined entirely by causal description, well, near enough entirely, by a perceptual causal link, the same sort of grounding. And you go to a complex demonstrative, its reference is determined just like the reference for a referential description. So let's go back to the referential description, the example we had. The table is covered with books. Compare that with that table is covered with books. Oversimplifying, I'm arguing that the reference determination of that table is the same as the reference determinant of the table. And that reference determinant determination is primarily the causal perceptual link. But, and this is addressing something you raised in your question, it's not only the causal perceptual link. In each case, we have the nominal table. And I favored from the beginning, but more explicitly as I went on, the idea that the reference of the conventional reference, the conventional reference of the table in that example, or that table in the other example, that the reference of this description and demonstrative, complex demonstrative, the reference is determined largely by the causal perceptual link, but also by the nominal table. So it refers to a table. Which table? The particular one that is the focus of the attention. Or putting it more in semantic terms, it refers to an object that the nominal table applies to, and that is causally perceptually linked to the speaker. So that is a descriptive element that I want to put in. But notice there's no descriptive element in with the simple demonstrative, and there's no descriptive element in my at least my final position. There's no descriptive element with proper names, or at least with paradigm proper names. Jack the Ripper, Julius are exceptions. So that's my position. A unified causal perceptual, largely causal perceptual view of reference determination for these phrases.
So what about natural kind terms? Because I don't think you've mentioned them.
Right. Yes. So again, inspired by Kripke, and of course later on, Putnam, later on for me that is, because I was listening to Kripke in '67. Later on, Putnam, who was another one of my teachers, went down this route of taking many other terms, what Saul called somewhat vaguely natural kind terms. Many other terms are like names. Now he was thinking they were like names in, well, he thought they were like names in quite a number of ways, but the key ways for my purposes were, he thought they were like names in that their reference was not determined by an associated description. Again, for ignorance and error arguments or reasons, one or two other reasons. And he thought that their reference could be borrowed. So this is exactly like names. And he also, I haven't mentioned rigidity, and I'm a bit inclined not to, but he thought proper names were rigid, and he thought these other terms were rigid. That opened up a bit of a can of worms, which I think maybe we shouldn't go into. So he thought they were alike in those ways, and Putnam did too, and so did I. Right. So that was what I went along with, all of that. But then I also took into my theory of natural kind terms the same sort of theory of grounding that I had for proper names, demonstratives, and definite descriptions. A grounding, a causal perceptual grounding. But in the case of a natural kind term, it's a causal perceptual grounding in a sample of the kind. A sample of tigers, a sample of gold. And then the term refers to everything, so the story went, of the same kind. What does that mean? With the same underlying nature or essence as the sample. That was the key idea you get. So once again, I've got a sort of naturalistic causal perceptual theory of grounding.
Right, this is very interesting, and I want to raise an issue that's widely discussed in in the literature. We mentioned Hartree-Field, and he raised it in his article on Tarski, namely whether it is possible at all to construct a solely causal theory of reference, or whether such a theory is always going to be somewhat incomplete. So what do you think about this worry?
Right, yes. Okay, good. I think what you just said, I'd forgotten that Hartree said this, but Hartree is very wise, so it's not surprising he said it. Yes. I have been aware from the very beginning that the theory of grounding I just mentioned, causal perceptual links to an object, is incomplete. And for a long time, I tried, I think foolishly, to try and make it more complete than it was by struggling to deal with what is called the choir problem and so on, and I don't really want to talk about it. I think this was all a mistake. To make it complete, we need to add something that's simply way beyond philosophers. What is going on in the grounding of a name at the dubbing or in its later uses? What is going on in the grounding of tiger or gold in the stuff? And I should mention multiple groundings. That was part of my theory, and by the way, many years later, Hilary Putnam agreed about multiple grounding. So what is going on in a grounding? You really need to say a lot more than what I'm saying about causal perceptual links to the object at the focus of attention. Where you need, first of all, you really need to appeal to the theory of perception, as it were. What exactly is at the focus of perception, and in virtue of what? And the truth of the matter is, we don't know at this point. This is a bit of real hard science for psychologists. Theory of perception is in its early days. And then there's the psycholinguistic problem. And how do we, as it were, get from whatever's happening in perception, what sort of causal processes, what is going on in the head? In a case where you're perceiving, let's back up a bit. Let's suppose that the theory of perception had advanced so far, the psychological theory, that we could give a very good account of what makes a particular object the focus of perception. Rather than, for example, here's a tiger. What makes the tiger the object of perception? You're looking at it, sure, but you're also looking at, after all, in your field of vision, leave aside the environment, there's tiger feet, tiger head, tiger tail, tiger whiskers. There's lots of things in your immediate perceptual environment. What makes which bit of it, what makes it the tiger rather than any of these other bits? Not only that, what makes the tiger the object of perception rather than this time slice of a tiger? These are very difficult questions, but let's suppose that the theory of perception had an answer for you. There would still be the question, how in grounding a name or grounding the word tiger, what mental processes go on, language acquisition processes, which take advantage of that particular causal perceptual link, now explained by the theory of perception. So we need a lot more theory of perception, a lot more psycholinguistics, and this is all terribly hard, and it's way beyond philosophers. I mean, it really is psychology and psycholinguistics, and you know, of course, psychologists and psycholinguists are doing terrific work, but this is just very hard. We know, go to psycholinguistics, we know very little about how this works. It's a received view that little children, age 3, 4, and 5, are acquiring something like 8 words a day. How? This is a terribly hard problem. So that's where I do certainly agree very much that the sort of theory of grounding that I'm putting forward is incomplete. It needs completion by future psycholinguistics and future psychology of perception, something that's way beyond philosophers.
So you mentioned the qua problem, and I want to talk a little bit about it, because in your answer to my previous question, I think you suggested that maybe this is a job for a theory of perception, right?
Yes, I do think that, yes. And I think it was a big mistake for me to agonize over this time and time again. And there's even a literature of people talking about it. Yeah. And it was an even bigger mistake to propose a solution to the qua problem, which involved supposing that in the grounding there was not only the causal perceptual link, but there was also an associated description of a category that the object was in. I think all of that was a mistake, and I've abandoned it. Right. At least 20 years ago, yes.
Right. So I know that you oppose classifying your theory as a hybrid one, but I want to relate this briefly to your idea.
Well, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
I'm opposed to describing my theory of proper names, paradigm ones, as hybrid. My theory of simple demonstratives as hybrid, they're not. There's no hybridity about it. My theory of definite descriptions is obviously hybrid, because it has, in the case, table is playing a role in reference fixing. My theory of complex demonstratives is obviously hybrid. And in something we briefly mentioned, non-paradigm names, like Jack the Ripper and Julius, which are often referred to as descriptive names, in my opinion, they have their description fixed by their reference fixed by description, but then they can be borrowed in the Kripkean way. So that's another hybrid theory. Right.
Well, that's great, actually, because I wanted to relate this to your idea of semantic molecularism, because I think that should fit a hybrid theory very well.
Yes, it does, yes. And well, perhaps, I mean, you use this phrase, perhaps we should say a word about what we're talking about here. There's semantic atomism, which is the idea that every word has its meaning and reference independent of any other word. It doesn't depend on any other word for its meaning and reference. And then you've got meaning holism, which is an astonishingly popular, crazy doctrine. Here, I feel like borrowing the rhetoric of Jerry Fodor, who thought it was just mad, and virtually sort of thought it was represented the end of civilization as we know it. But it was astonishingly popular, particularly in psychology. And according to meaning holism, the meaning of any word is dependent on the meaning of every other word in the language. And I'm right with Jerry in thinking this is a crazy doctrine, popular, as at least was, I mean, back in the 80s. And then there's meaning molecularism, which I'm in favor of. Jerry, I should say, was, with a qualification or two, was a meaning atomist. I am in favor of meaning molecularism, which means that I think that, well, certainly, and as I was just illustrating, I think some words are atomistic, that is, they have their meaning independent of any other. Proper names, paradigm ones, and simple demonstrative. But then there are words which, again, we've illustrated a few minutes ago, like definite descriptions and complex demonstratives, and descriptive names, which have meanings which are partly dependent on relationships to other terms. And we haven't discussed at all, but I'm quite ready to contemplate some terms which are entirely covered by a description theory. Mm. So their meaning is definitely dependent on the meanings of other terms. A paradigm example, two paradigm examples. Bachelor. It's common to think its reference is determined by adult unmarried male. So it refers to what they refer to, so it's obviously dependent on those words for its reference. Vixen, it's common to think its meaning is determined by its association with female and fox. That's an example of molecularism. But notice, there's no suggestion in what I just said that its meaning is dependent on its relationship to every word. Just a few, yeah.
Well, since we only have a limited amount of time, we have to focus on some class of terms. So let's focus on proper names and this idea that their meaning is their causal mode of reference, or in the case of empty names, causal mode of purportedly referring. How did you come up with that idea?
Right, yeah. It's turned out to be really regarded as a shocking idea.
It is.
And I mean, I find the history here interesting. I came up with it right at the beginning when I was doing my dissertation, but I wasn't interested in it, and I didn't even think it was. I didn't even think it was interesting. It just seemed to me sort of obvious that. And in my first paper on this subject, my 1974 paper, Singular Terms, it's all about reference. But there is this one paragraph, I think, where I confront, almost in an offhand way, the issue of meaning. And I say something to the effect of the meaning of the name, if we need to talk about this at all. And I didn't even say this is really important. I just, is going to be found, or something like this, in the causal mode of reference that we have been discussing. Why did I say that? Well, I wasn't really thinking much about the meaning, but I was, after all, familiar with the whole history here of names. And first we had the million theory. Wonderful, simple theory that the meaning is simply the referent, basically. We think of Mill as having that view, but the view is to be found back in the ancients, you know, in some of the Platonic dialogues and so on. It's a very attractive idea for names, and once you think about it for names, you may be gulled into thinking about it for a lot of other things. And we know that this simple, delightful theory of names, we were driven out of that, as I was fond of saying, out of this million paradise by consideration brought forward by Frege, the famous problem of identity statements, and Russell, the famous problem of existence statements. Frege's problem, of course, became known as Frege's puzzle. I'll give my version of it. Take any identity statement, Samuel Clemens as Mark Twain, that has a different meaning from Samuel Clemens as Samuel Clemens. Frege put it in terms of cognitive value. I think that was a mistake, but that they differ in meaning seems to me to be indubitable. Mm. And how can that be if the million is right? So Frege and Russell, and for decades, everyone thought that this theory was no good. The million theory. So if that's no good and questions of meaning come up, which I wasn't addressing in my early stuff, I thought, oh, we must resort to some causal mode of presentation. And that, when the issue did come up very forcibly, a bit later, with the direct reference theorists, again, I really moved from this rather casual remark about meaning, by the time of my book in 1981, to vigorously urging causal modes as the meaning of proper names. For the reason that, how else can you explain the difference in meaning between Samuel Clemens as Samuel Clemens and Samuel Clemens as Mark Twain? The old problem that drove us out of the million paradise is still with us. Kripke has shown that Frege's solution to this problem, which was, we posit descriptive senses for a name. And so Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens have different descriptive senses, and that explains the different meanings between the two statements. A delightful, beautiful solution to the problem, but the trouble is, as Kripke showed us, it's false. They don't have descriptive senses. Well, if they don't have descriptive senses, they still nonetheless have, Frege thought of these descriptive senses as modes of presentation, very nice way of talking about modes of reference. Okay, Kripke has shown us that that view of the mode of presentation or reference is false, but still they do refer, and they refer somehow, and if Kripke-inspired theories like mine are right, they refer causally. So it falls out. The meaning is the causal mode of presentation. That's how I came to it. That was then regarded as absolutely shocking.
Right. So I think it still is, but it's for many at least.
Yes.
It's interesting, and I'm very fond of hearing about Frege in such a positive light from you, right? Because he doesn't appear that often in your writing. But to me that...
Well, I do often say what I just said.
Right.
Frege got it absolutely right in thinking that the meaning of a proper name, or for that matter other terms, is given by their mode of presentation. He just had the wrong mode of presentation.
Not descriptive, but causal, obviously. Yes. So you describe your views on meaning as realist and conservative, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because perhaps this sort of we could look at that project of conservation as one which actually has to do with, for instance, modes of presentations, but the revolutionary part is taking them to be causal, as you've just said. Can you say something?
Yes. So that remark of mine about my views being realist and conservative, it really is in a very different context. Very different context. I wouldn't for the moment claim that what I'm proposing for the meaning of a proper name is conservative. As we can see from the outrage it provoked, my favorite example of the outrage is from my friend Nathan Salmon, who described it as bizarre and a category mistake. So it obviously wasn't conservative at all, the theory of grounding. So my remark of being realist and conservative is in a very different context. And it's in the context of the sort of debates that went on in the 80s, and the 70s perhaps particularly, with highly revisionist views of meaning. I am very much in an old tradition, a truth referential tradition, thinking of meanings of expressions, of words being largely to be explained in terms of their reference, not entirely perhaps, but largely, and the meaning of complex expressions like sentences to be explained in terms of their truth conditions. This all came under threat. First, some people claimed, interestingly enough, one of my mentors, Quine, was really an eliminativist about meaning in this robust sense that I've just described. The Churchlands, Paul and Patricia, were eliminativist about it. I'm rejecting that sort of eliminativism. I take it seriously, but I reject it. But a more common sort of somewhat radicalism, not as radical as eliminativism, was revisionism. And in the 80s, revisionism was very, very common. What do I have in mind here? There was the idea that the only meanings we needed for the purposes of serious science, and particularly psychology, which also took into account language, the only meanings we needed were what were called narrow meanings. What's going on here? Well, the sort of meaning in the tradition, the truth referential meanings, were wide meanings in this sense. They were partly constituted by relationships between what's inside people's heads and the world. A very striking example of this, of course, is the theory of groundings we were just talking about, or even the theory of reference borrowing. But the meaning of my term Aristotle is not determined, and your term Aristotle, it's not determined by anything in my head. It's determined, only a little bit determined by what's in my head, but an awful lot by what's gone, by this causal chain all the way back through 2 millennia till we get to Aristotle. As Putnam, who was just wonderful at coming up with neat, snappy things, as he once said, meanings just ain't in the head. Mm-hmm. That is a core view, Hilary is capturing so well what is a core view of the tradition. And I'm embracing that core view of the tradition. I'm, as they say, an externalist along. So, this idea that meanings are determined by things outside the head was the status quo, it seems to me. And the people, the revisionists in the 80s, were arguing against this and saying, no, all this stuff outside the head is irrelevant to the only meanings we need for our scientific purposes. They're not denying, of course, that there is all this stuff outside the head, the external world, and even our links to that external world. They're just saying it's not constitutive of meaning, or it's not constitutive of any meaning we want for the purposes of our psychology, and so on and so on. And there were some very eminent people who argued this sort of view, people whose work I'm a great fan of, like Jerry Fodor and Steve Stitch, and lots and lots of others. So this was a revisionist view of meaning, and I think it's wrong. Mm. That's what I'm getting at when I say I'm conservative. I'm conservative in that I'm hanging in there with the traditional sort of view of which ascribed to expressions wide meanings, truth referential meanings.
Mm. So I want to go back to something that you've already mentioned, namely direct reference theories, because you can often read that a lot of people claim that they're the sort of most straightforward developments of Kripke's ideas. You don't agree. No. I don't agree either. A lot of people are not that fond of putting it in this way. Right. So why do you think that is? Why do you think so many people actually think that direct reference is what arose out of, well, first Mill, but then Kripke as well? And
it's tied in with why my view seems so shocking. The view I said a minute ago that meanings, a lot of meanings, including the meanings of proper names, but I would want to say, for example, the meaning of a referential description is its mode of reference, because I think that Fregean idea is right for everything, every word. And in the case of a definite description, a referential one, the meaning is largely a causal mode, not entirely, because the description plays a role. Okay, so why do people think, oh, that's so shocking? Well, the reason ties in with the answer to your question here. People who approved of what Saul was saying about proper names, say, and people who disapproved with what Saul said about proper names, did take it to have the consequence, as you pointed out a second ago, that the meaning of a name was simply its referent. Why? They couldn't think of an alternative. Everyone was familiar with the Fregean view, which was that the meaning of a name is expressed by an associated description which determines its reference. That's the good old view. along comes Saul and shows us that that's got to be false. What else then can the meaning be but the object itself? That sort of inference pattern went on not just with the people who loved the causal theory, but the people who didn't, its critics. And most vividly, this is, if you're going into my autobiography here, what got me exercised about the meaning of names, and what got me bent on arguing against direct reference. Direct reference, of course, is the rebirth of the million view, was an article by Brian Law in 1976. I was absolutely shocked by this, because Brian attributed to Brian, who was actually not an enthusiast for the Kripke view, so he was sort of on the other side, but he took it for granted, just as you said, that the Kripkean view had the consequence that names, the million view of names was right, or what became known as the direct reference view of names, or sometimes it's called the Russellian view of names, which is in a way a little unfortunate. And that was in 76. I'd never even heard this view before that. As I'd said in my 74 paper, I just briefly made a remark about it. I was absolutely shocked to see that Brian, who was obviously an excellent philosopher, was saying that this is part of the movement that I was part of. Mm-hmm. So I immediately leapt in and argued, no, this was not. In fact, I said it was preposterous. No one could. I said, you shouldn't attribute this to anyone without adequate support. What support did Brian give for charging? He attributed it to Kripke, as you said, and he attributed it to Donnellan. And I argued back, look, it's not in Kripke, and it's not in the works of Donnellan you cite. And this was a pattern. For the next 10 years, and perhaps even to this day, people attribute this view to Kripke, even though there is not a word of it in Kripke. And we know very, very well, anyone who knows him, that he didn't believe it. He remained on the fence. He didn't believe my view, I hasten to add, but he didn't view direct reference. So what did he view? What did he believe? Who knows? Nathan Salmon, Scott Soames, they're on the direct reference side. I'm on the other side. We're all, of course, enormously influenced by Saul, and we all wanted him to take a stand. And I even once in public, when I was here, he was in a group, and all the direct reference people are there, and I say, okay, Saul, it's time for you to tell us where you stand. and he didn't respond. Oh. So it's not in Saul, and he doesn't believe it. It's not clear what he did believe. I think he was basically agnostic. And he was agnostic because he couldn't see how to figure it all out.
But maybe this is also because in Naming a Necessity, he explicitly says that this is not a full theory. Don't take this to constitute a theoretical proposal.
He was only there talking about reference, though. Yeah. He wasn't talking about meaning.
Yeah, that's also.
He didn't actually. Look, I'm not a great scholar, or even any sort of a scholar. I don't remember him saying anything about meaning in the original Naming a Necessity. Now, the postscript, in the face, I think, or maybe I'm wrong. I think he said something in the postscript. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's not in Saul, and it wasn't in the original Donnellan either. That is the 66 papers. Well, the 66 papers are on. The 60s papers are on definite descriptions. He had the 1971, was it, or 72 paper on proper names. It's not in there either. I thought it wasn't in his 1974 paper on Speaking of Nothing. But I think Andrea Bianchi convinced me it was in there, and I think he's right. And it was certainly in later Donlan papers. But as I said, well, perhaps I haven't said, but by the end of the 80s, the idea was all over the place that this direct reference theory was a consequence of Saul's and Donlan's view. Right. Even though there was no evidence that it was in Saul. Yeah.
Right. So why do you think that it's so popular?
Well,
Because it's very popular nowadays.
I've given you my... to a certain degree, I can't understand this.
Okay.
Because it seems to me, as I've said several times in print, I didn't even contemplate it as a possible theory of meaning for proper names until I came across it in Brown law.
Right.
Rejecting it. I thought, well, no one could believe that. And why did I think this? Because hadn't we all learnt from Frege, Russell, 100 years ago that this was no good? So it didn't seem to me even a candidate to be of the meaning. So why has it become so popular? I mean, some of my best friends really believe it. You know, I've been arguing with David Brown more than nearly 30 years now. I don't really understand why they believe it, beyond the mistaken idea that there is no alternative. I mean, Scott Soames wrote a very engaging and interesting book. I think it was called Beyond Rigidity, is that right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't even mention the alternative, the causal mode of reference alternative. He just thinks, putting it in Jerry Fodor's delightful terms, he thinks direct reference is the only theory in town. Even though he knows that there is another theory in town, which he doesn't mention. And why doesn't he mention? My best hypothesis is he thinks it's too preposterous.
Right.
The Devitt view is so preposterous we shouldn't mention it. We don't want to distract people from the clear and beautiful truth of direct reference by introducing an alternative. That's my best answer to you, but it's not much of an answer. I don't know what's going on with him or with Nathan or with David Brown.
Right, but I guess you could say that, well, they argue for it from a false promise of ontological economy, so to say, because you don't have to commit yourselves to any Fregean senses, but you don't commit yourself to any Fregean senses either.
It's not an ontological economy problem. It's a theoretical economy, isn't it? Or after all, what I'm doing, I'm saying you have to ascribe to a proper name not simply the uncontroversial property of referring to a certain object. Everyone agrees about that. I'm saying that we have to ascribe to the proper name the property of referring to that object in a particular causal way. And that is not as simple, theoretically simple as the direct reference view. And I think you're probably right. I think they probably think that this is, well, why complicate your theory? Yeah.